All right. I'm actually going to kick this off. A good afternoon to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satgar. I'm an academic at WITS. I lead a project called Emancipatory Futures Studies, which is one of the co-hosts of this platform. I also edit the Democratic Marxism series, and I chair the board of the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center. Today's Democratic Marxism seminar is, well, following on the heels of numerous ones we've had since 2013. It's kicking off our year, 2021, and today we'll be focusing on remembering Leo Panitch. Leo passed on December 19th from a viral pneumonia. And just to give you some sense of Leo's credentials, Leo was a distinguished research professor of political science at York University, a renowned political economist, a Marxist theorist, and editor of the Socialist Register since 1985. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including The End of Parliamentary Socialism, Working Class Politics in Crisis, and Renewing Socialism, Transforming Democracy, Strategy, and Imagination. I met Leo 3 times in my activist life. I didn't know him as intimately as many of our panelists who will talk about him today. But the first time was in 1999 when, together with a comrade from the Communist Party, we were busy doing national political education, and as democratic socialists, wanted to understand what was the new thinking on the left in the world. So we traveled. And one of the people we wanted to find and talk to was Leo Panitch. And we did an interview with him en route in New York. And it was a very, very amazing encounter. And that's available in a publication called New Frontiers for Socialism, Conversations in a Global Journey. And I think today we'll also share that publication. It's freely available to anybody who wants it in the chat group. I also met Leo then at a socialist studies conference, and he gave a brilliant input on the Greek situation and particularly Syriza. And then subsequently, we had him and Sam come to South Africa and present on their work on empire and engage with our students and progressive forces here. This afternoon, we're going to have 2 thematic panels engaging on and remembering and celebrating Leo. The first panel we'll look at Leo's life and his contribution to the global left. We have on that panel Sam Gindin. Sam has been a longtime trade unionist in the Metalworkers Union in Canada. He eventually joined Leo at the university, and they worked on the Empire book together and other publications. They've been long-standing friends and comrades. We also have Ana Garcia from also had a very, very close working relationship with Leo over the years. And she'll also share insights from her location. And then we have Ingar Solty, who was also very close to Leo, his student actually. And Ingar's based at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. And he'll also share his own perspective on where Leo fits into the global left. And then, of course, we'll transition to a second panel, which will look at Leo's contribution to Marxism and democratic socialism. And there we have Dinga Sikwebu. Dinga has been one of our leading working class intellectuals in the country, and he's had a long historical association with Leo Panitch. We also have Patrick Bond, one of our leading Marxist political economists in the country, and who also has had a long relationship with the Socialist Register and with Leo, and I suppose had many contentious debates as well. So we'll hear from Patrick, and I'll share a few thoughts as well. So I'm going to hand over to Awande Buthelezi to convene us around the first panel. Awande, over to you.
Thank you, Vish. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'll be chairing today's first panel. And I'll just be giving every speaker 15 minutes to speak. Then we will have a 30-minute session for discussion. We will begin in the order of Sam, Anna, and then Inga. So Sam, you may go first. Sorry, Sam, I think you're still on mute.
Yep. Yes. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I think I'm going to start by just saying a few things about Leo's basic work, and then I'll leave a lot of that to others to elaborate on, and then I think I want to get into the question of Leo and internationalism. And if I could, sometime over the day, I'd like to say something about the register, because Greg Albo was supposed to be here, but couldn't make it. And if I could just take a minute or two to do that, that would be great. Leo's work focused on three things. First of all, the state. And he thought that the Marxist theory of the state was quite weak and had to be developed. And especially with globalization, that a lot of people saw this as a retreat from the state, where Leo's argument was that globalization actually made the state more important than ever. Second of all, his work focused on how do you build the power to take on the state, which raised the question of agency and the centrality of the working class. But Leo emphasized always that we could not romanticize the working class, that the working class that had been shaped by capitalism was a working class that was fragmented, it was dependent on capital, it was exhausted, pressures of survival made it look to the short term and to particular local interests rather than the long term. So the real question was, could a working class so deformed by capitalism actually contribute to making a revolution, to transforming society? And could it even imagine doing that? Could it even conceive of doing that? And that in turn, therefore, raised the question of party, that there was nothing spontaneous about the working class becoming a revolutionary force. The working class itself had to be transformed before you could talk about transforming society. And one just very quick point on the party is that his emphasis on the party was not just how do you take power, but first of all, this crucial question of how you develop the confidence and capacities of the working class itself to organize and strategize and understand and debate constructively, because that was fundamental, and that this was a fundamental part of the party. And the second part of that was that it wasn't just a question of taking power in terms of getting into the state, but transforming the state. What do you do with that power? And this really came to the fore with Syriza, because Syriza had a triple quandary when it got elected. One was, you get elected and you're running a capitalist society, you're governing a capitalist society. So how do you meet people's needs and expectations in that moment, especially when you haven't been elected on a socialist basis, but on frustrations with neoliberalism and trying to get around neoliberalism? So that was the first question. How do you just govern? The second question is, how do you actually build a base simultaneously so you increase your future options, with your options being limited? And that meant you needed a party that was simultaneously organizing that base. And that includes using that base to challenge the party in the state. And it's something that the South Africans would be very familiar with. And the third thing was this question of transforming the state, that it isn't just taking over something that you can then use, that the capitalist state developed historically to address capitalist problems. It had certain capacities, but it didn't have other kinds of capacities. And part of the whole problem of socialism and of making a socialist society is discovering and inventing and creating new kinds of capacities for a new kind of society that could deal with planning and deal with it in a democratic way. So I think those things framed Leo's basic perspective and outlook and contributions. Now, Leo and I came to South Africa, and I can't actually remember which trip this was, but the actual date doesn't matter. We got picked up at the airport by NUMSA. We were rushed to a conference where there was apparently a debate going on as unions were having discussions about how to come together in the post-apartheid period. And as we pulled into the conference, somebody quickly opened the door, grabbed Leo's arm and said, "You've got to get in there quick. They're debating the state, and there's two different camps, and both of them are using you as their examples. So I want to raise that because this wasn't atypical. Leo was all over the world in these debates. He was in Brazil, he was in Guatemala, he was in Greece, he was in Germany, he was in England. He was an international actor. And that dimension of Leo's internationalism is central. Yet there seems to be a contradiction here because Leo's work was so state-centric. And that's really what I want to talk about. So what is the relationship between this internationalism and being state-centric? So obviously socialism is universal. So anybody who's a socialist is an internationalist. That goes without saying. But the question of power is concentrated in the state, and therefore making change depends on the state. And even with globalization, where a lot of people thought that there's a contradiction, what I would call a mechanical contradiction between international production and nation states, what in fact happened, not because somebody invented it, but what happened historically was that states were internationalized. States came to take responsibility for global accumulation within their own territories, within their own borders. And that actually made states more important than ever. In addition to their normal functions, they now had to take responsibility for globalization. As well, at the level of ideology, globalization was not sold. It was sold, but that wasn't the main point where it was sold through international institutions or even the US. It was sold by national states. It was national states saying, if we enter globalization, we can be one of the winners, and that will lead to national development. So nationalism was constitutive of globalization, not in opposition to it. And when that promise failed, the question was whether it would be the left or the right that would mobilize the frustrations. Now, in terms of internationalism and really developing internationalism, a lot of the trade union movement, especially in the US in the 70s, going back to the 70s, emphasized internationalism. The AFL-CIO was emphasizing the need, if you're going to bargain with multinational corporations, you had to have international unions. The trouble with that was what they were really calling for was extending business unionism internationally. And it was an alternative to politics and the politics of the state. And the issue is that unless you can build your power domestically, you can't help that much internationally. Of course, you can do specific kind of support. We would, for example, make sure that our pension funds weren't invested in South Africa during the apartheid period. If there was a very specific strike, maybe you could take some action. If Mexican workers, a union was being destroyed. But on a normal basis, if you couldn't even have real solidarity, real class solidarity across public and private sector workers, if steel workers and auto workers were competing, if the South African trade union movement was split, it was very hard to imagine that you could build a greater solidarity across oceans, across languages, across a totally different context. So to really be effective in terms of internationalism, it meant that you had to be strong nationally. It was the only way. If you thought about canceling debt, if you thought about transferring technology to the global south, you had to think about taking over state, taking over control over production. So this was crucial. Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto in terms of the working class had to come to terms with its own bourgeoisie first. And he also put it very well in terms of saying that the international struggle was international in substance, because when you struggled in one place, it created space for people to struggle elsewhere. But in form, it took a national form. You were struggling nationally. And that's very important. In terms of what we can actually do about internationalism, one of the crucial things is becoming stronger in our own countries. So rather than making concessions and undermining workers elsewhere, we could be setting higher standards and creating space for others else to fight. And the second thing about internationalism that was so important, and here Leo was crucial, was rather than chasing every new model and saying, aha, here we have the example. And then when that failed, instead of assessing why it failed, moving on to other examples, the question is, what can we really learn from each other? Any of our victories in the recent periods have been partial. So you have to look at these partial, almost experiments and say, what can we really learn? Not just judging them about who failed, but assessing what were the limits of what we were doing there and what can we learn from it. And that kind of spread of international analysis and international information and often international inspiration is crucial. So let me just turn from there to the question of the party, because Leo spent so much time on it. And I just want to reemphasize those two elements of the party, that the key question is, how do we're not at a revolutionary moment. And the key question, the prior question is, how do we actually create the working class into a confident, coherent social force? And the questions about the structure of a party have to focus very much on that. And as I said earlier, it has to focus on, if you come into governance, to recognize that this is a long process and you somehow have to bridge all these issues of building the working class, governing, and transforming the state. So what was so important about it, for one, was it wasn't just that Leo was there as an internationalist. It was important for us because we saw how impressive the South African working class was. It was way ahead in terms of consciousness and understanding than we were. And that reinforced the argument that internationalism, in a sense, starts at home. It was the strength of the South African working class at home and in their communities that was so important to the end of apartheid. A second tragedy in South Africa was that with the end of apartheid, the struggle becomes more complicated. It isn't, as someone said in a poster, as black and white anymore. And what was fundamental was the working class having its own party that was mobilizing them. And instead what happened was the Communist Party, which had been so courageous and had so much credibility, went into the state and left the workers on their own, and in fact played a role in integrating the workers into global capitalism in terms of limiting what the possibilities were and moving to a kind of corporatism. So that was actually also crucial. If I could, I'd like to maybe just turn to the register, because the register was really ground zero for Leo. The register brought all these things together. It was a place where Leo tried to create a Marxist community internationally by bringing people together from all kinds of struggles everywhere, and try to have a publication that was non-sectarian, that was accessible in terms of trying to communicate rather than to impress, and that stimulated debate. And I just want to read, the latest issue is called Beyond Digital Capitalism, and it speaks to how wide the range of the register was. I mean, this issue tries to demystify economic determinism and technological determinism in particular. And it's got articles that range from, it ranges from anthropology to the pandemic, to socialist planning, to fashion, to feminism and racism, to high tech, to everything about the new technology. And let me just read a passage from their preface as a way of concluding my talk. The proof of capitalism's continued dynamism, even in the face of severe global economic crisis, lay in the most successful and most celebrated high-tech corporations of the new information sector, which really were restructuring and refashioning not only our ways of communicating, but of working and consuming, indeed, ways of living. Yet precisely because this was taking place within the logics of capital accumulation and exploitation, and through the reproduction of capitalist social relations, this produced new contradictions and irrationalities. Perhaps none of these was greater than those revealed by the contrast between the investment, planning, and preparations that went into the interminable competitive race for more speed by way of reducing latency in digital communications by so many milliseconds on the one hand, and on the other, the lack of investment, planning, and preparation that underlay the scandalous slowness of the responses to the spreading COVID-19 pandemic across the world. So I'll just conclude by saying, with my emphasis on the national, that what Leo was able to do was to engage in that national struggle with an internationalist sensibility. And I think that was absolutely crucial. I don't know how my time is.
Thank you so much, Sam, for those insights, getting us started for what I hope will be a very enriching conversation. And next we have Ana Garcia.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah, that's great. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's really great. I feel very honored and privileged to be here. Even talking after Sam makes me even shy a little bit. But I really, really appreciate Michelle and Vish organizing this event. I mean, this event is a sort of result of Leo's work and Leo's capacity of making connections, of bringing people together, of going beyond differences, arguments, and keep the track in really political, important, central discussions. I miss Greg here too, so Sam already mentioned, and many others. And I feel, I have no other word. I feel privileged, I feel honored, and I'm really happy, despite the situation, despite the occasion that brings us together to be here. So thank you so much, Vish, Michelle, Jane, for organizing, and everyone here, to more than 100 people watching us. I haven't really, I'm not presenting a paper or anything like this. I will talk a little bit about, things that I learned from Leo as a person, and things that I've learned from Leo and Sam's work, which were really, really important to my own formation in international relations and political science. And I will bring some of the main parts of the last interview we did with him. I had also the privilege, again, the word, to interview Leo right before he went to the hospital. He was already feeling a lot of pain in his back. We're exchanging emails during the whole year last year. And I planned an interview with him on the week of the US elections, expecting to get his comments on this, very important world event of the US election last year. And it happened to be his last interview. So for us, and I, get very sensible and emotional about this. But one aspect that I want to emphasize from the Brazilian perspective, and I think that Sam really summarized it very, very beautifully, and the way that Leo was internationalist and socialist on the one hand, but was always capable of bringing us to the central point of the theory of the state. And this was very important. This apparent contradiction, which is not a contradiction, was fundamental for discussions in international relations, sort of, very anti-Marxist knowledge area. It was so important that we've organized in Brazil in 2016 a seminar. We called it a colloquium at that time, what we called IR and Marxism colloquium, and then IR and Marxism network. And Leo was one of the guests of this very first meeting, together with Beverly Silver from the Giovanni Arrighi Center. So we had two very different perspectives. One on the, more closer to the dependency theory, to world system theory, and to inter-imperial rivalry theory, and the one which is Leo's approach, more central to the US role in managing, constructing, building global capitalism through the American informant empire. So this was very, very important for us. I was able to bring Leo to Brazil 2 times, one in 2013 and one in 2016. And this occasion was the very, grounding of the IR Marxism network, for which Leo was a sort of, I would say, a sort of sponsor of an inspiration for all of us. And you can see that in the different tributes that Leo got after, the weekend in December, from the landless movement in Brazil, from different Brazilian scholars, from people in Argentina, in Chile, besides those other countries, Greece, of course, Turkey, of course, Germany, South Africa. And it's interesting because Leo and Sam's work were not really widely translated. CLACSO, the Latin American Social Science Council, they translated during Atilio Baron's presidency, they translated the seminal article, American, what's the name again of the title again? Well, American Capitalism and the US Empire. But that was in 2008 and 2005 and 2004. And then a Spanish editor translated the book, The Making of Global Capitalism. But besides that, I did a translation of an interview once. But besides that, there weren't many things translated. But still, people were using Leo's and Sam's work in the Brazilian academy, and also in social movements such as the landless movement, the MST. So I think it's really important to stress this. I was able to meet Leo when I was a PhD student. I went to Toronto, I met Ingar there, I met Sam there. Then I was able to meet Patrick through Leo some years later. And still we kept on reading those articles. I kept on using these articles in my classes, and I kept on using the book for my articles and my own analysis on the Brazilian case of the Brazilian internationalization of corporations, Brazil's South-South investments, and then the BRICS, China, and all of the work that I've been doing with Patrick. And I want to stress how we see and why we sustain Leo's and Sam's work as part of Marxism within IR theory. And that's mainly on 2 concepts, on 2 axes of discussion. And the one is the very nature and function of this capitalist state, as Sam already mentioned, and the notion, the concept of the internationalization of the state. That's been discussed by others in international relations, but Leo and Sam had this take on this concept, which is the capacity first of the US state to manage, to construct, and to take responsibility of the accumulation of capital, of free trade, of free investment flows, of financial flows within and outside the United States, and then of other states taking that responsibility to themselves, and not in the name of the US or in the name of others' interests, but in their own interest to do this. And that's mainly equal for central states such as European states, the US, Japan, as well as for more peripheral states such as Brazil, South Africa, and others. So the very responsibility of promoting capitalism, of promoting capital accumulation, and not only, that is very important, within their own territories, treating international capital as national capital and this sort of things, but also promoting their own capital abroad. That was a main point of our discussions around Brazilian multinationals and Chinese multinationals, etc. So this very sort of contribution of peripheral states to the US managed global capitalism. So this is very important, and Leo and Sam, in all of their work, they emphasize the role and the tensions that play the role there among different state agencies, be there US agencies and also agencies in other states. So it's a contradictory phenomenon, it's tension, but that's how the 20th century capitalism was built, and also it's still true for the 21st century configuration of capitalism. And the other main issue is the configuration of imperialism, disagreeing with the classical work of Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and others, who saw in that time, the beginning of the 20th century, this movement inside out of capital for the exploitation of the workforce and natural resources in the colonial areas, in the peripheral areas such as South America and Africa. But they brought it to the central question of how those states, even in that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, in the interwar period, how those states also had to manage capital accumulation and exploitation within their own territory, so that imperialism was not one-way move from capital export from inside, from imperial colonial metropolis states to the colonies and to the peripheral area, but actually a movement inside out and outside in. And that is the point of the construction of capitalism in the 20th century in the lines of what they call US informal empire. This informal empire means the integration of other states, first the main capitalist states, first European states, but then the other states too, into the American functioning capitalism, which means it was not necessary or not the first issue to occupy territories directly anymore, but to rebuild those states as capitalist states, as states capable of managing, again, taking responsibility of taking all the measures possible to facilitate capital accumulation within their own territories and also outside. So that, the emerging of first the European countries, okay, and then Japan, and today China, they need to be understood as part of this capacity of the United States to penetrate, coordinate, and integrate these emerging economies into global capitalism as a whole. So this has been, again, very important to my own work and to many others. And I emphasize that again. I kind of feel like representing here many in Brazil and in South America who have their works based on this very idea, which is not an easy idea to accept in our case, because many people really hoped that the emergence of Brazil during the Lula administration was to give hope for another stage of development. So the emergency of China nowadays is to give hope of an alternative, anti-hegemonic alternative to the US hegemony, these kind of things. This is very widespread among the left in South America. And it's very easy to buy this sort of idea, because of course we need to start building alternatives to US hegemony. but it doesn't really grasp the deeper processes that really took place in this construction of global capitalism, the centrality of the US dollar, the centrality of US institutions and US law for global trade and global investment and these kind of things. Okay, so I don't have much time anymore. I want to say just very few more things. I want to first of all invite you all to watch the interview. It is online, it is on YouTube. I can put the link here for you. There are many important issues that we talked about there, and which was very important for our current situation in Brazil. For instance, yes, I will. How to name the situation that we believe in here in Brazil and at that time in the US. Is it fascism? Is it not? Is it proto-fascism? Is it neo-fascism? And it doesn't matter, because what is important is to understand and to grasp the way that Sam just put it, how the frustrations of the working class with the results of globalization were taken by the far right and taken forward by the far right to take power, and how the far right is connected to militias, how the far right is using technology to keep power and to go further. And now, for our case in Brazil, from the government is building its power to stay longer. And that's the case that we've been having now. The other great issue that I won't have time to go in is the discussion on deglobalization. Maybe Patrick will go to this later. It was an argument between Leo and Patrick around this, and Leo was very emphatic on the notion that there isn't any deglobalization. The US is more integrated than ever with China, and China is opening its financial market gradually to US firms. And the very issue of the Chinese rise and how the working classes in the US and elsewhere should deal with this. And Leo ends the interview exactly with the point that Sam just raised on how we do have to go back to rebuilding our state, to take our state, to build our struggle towards the state power first, and how to do this in combination and with conversation with other states, not building a fiction of an enemy, of a socialist enemy, as they want to say about China. So I will finish just saying that I really, really appreciate this. This is a result of Leo's generosity, of Leo's capacity to bring people together, to connect people. And I really thank Vish and Michelle to organize this. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we appreciate you being here to share and contribute your experiences, your thoughts on this panel. And now for our final speaker on the panel, Ingar, Solty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also, Michelle and Vish, for organizing this. It's wonderful to see you all here, comrades, Anna, Sam, Dinga, Nande. It's wonderful to be able to commemorate Leo in this way. It's been 2 months that Leo has passed, and I still find it very hard to accept the fact. I am aware that we're all not immortal. I was aware of through email and Skype conversations with Leo that he had back pain from the summer, and that he was admitted to the hospital in November. But the last times that I had dinner with him in Montreal in 2019 at the Organisez la Résistance conference and HM in London later that year, and also during our US election panel with Megan Day, Leo, and Bill Fletcher, he just seemed unkillable. And I find it very hard to accept. Like, I'm currently doing revisions for a Socialist Register essay, and I have Leo's comments on it, and I constantly hear his voice talking. And I only can imagine how hard it must be for Sam, you, for Melanie, Maxime, Vida, for Greg, like, to deal with this. So it's very good that we can be here and commemorate Leo this way. I had many conversations after Leo had died with all of the students who should be here, just like me, commemorating Leo. and I realized once more how important he was to so many people. Angela Joya, one of his PhD students, she said that he was an umbrella for working class kids. And I think he was such a moral and intellectual mentor and giant because he was interested in things his students had to say. He was able to listen, and he remembered what students thought and think. And it also showed in the way he taught his courses based on like the incoherent notes from his students and the questions they had raised. And he would continue reading all his students wrote ever after, like until the end, really, and comment on it. So he was a real Marxist, knowing that intellectual endeavors and knowledge production are a collective effort. And he was a very untraditional intellectual in the Gramscian sense. He was aware that even as a distinguished research professor and one of the leading world intellectuals, he could still learn from others, and he was in need of learning from others. And he was an organic intellectual himself in the sense that he was much more interested in socialist politics than in academia politics, even though he was one of the most accomplished and most referenced intellectuals in the world. But as Leo once often used to say, if Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin had the chance to become professors, there probably wouldn't have been an October Revolution or a German Revolution. And so I want to look back at Leo and we observe a long life in lifelong struggle and a struggle for socialism over stretching across 6 or even 7 decades. And as Brecht in his The Mother wrote, those who are weak don't fight. Those who are stronger might fight for an hour. Those who are stronger still might fight for many years. The strongest fight their whole life. They are the indispensable ones. So Leo was a socialist revolutionary, and in the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking of how unlikely and original Leo's scholarship and politics were, because Leo was a socialist revolutionary in non-even counter-revolutionary times. And I want to focus on that in what I'm talking about, because even though as historical materialists, we excel in historicizing everything, including ourselves, we sometimes forget like the longue durée, or we sometimes don't speak about the longue durée, especially because we're so situation-oriented thinkers, always knowing that the truth is always historically concrete and that we have to engage or intervene in the real configuration of the world today. So I was trained in Marxism in the early 2000s, so much later than Greg and Sam and everybody else had the pleasure to meet Leo. I went to the University of Marburg, which was considered Red Marburg or a caterer school for the German Communist Party. You might want to check out Lothar Peters' book called Marx on Campus, to which I wrote the introduction, to see what this was about. Marburg was considered orthodox, class reductionist, a real blast from the past in the 90s and 2000s, hopelessly fallen out of time, according to all the modern ideas, as you know, the third way, beyond left and right, post-foundationalism, the end of history, the end of grand narratives, and you probably also remember the simulacrum and the raison. And still, when I came to Toronto, I had translated Sam and Leo's book, Global Capitalism and American Empire. But nonetheless, I gave Leo an essay called, which I had written for this argument, called Tony Kushner, the American Angel of History. And when he gave it back to me, commenting on it, he said, so you're a philosopher. And I felt flattered because I thought it was a compliment, but he was, of course, kidding. And he was pulling a joke. And a joke that continued through the socialist song nights that we had at Leo's place and at my place, where he would present me with the Adorno was right t-shirt, of course, meaning that Adorno wasn't right. But what I'm trying to say is that it was Leo who really taught me Marxist political economy, and he taught me to be an uncompromising Marxism. And the people I had learned Marxism from prior to that, like Frank Deppe, they recognized that. When I came back in 2012, I just to Marburg, I'd just written a piece on the US elections titled Bourgeois Class Blindness. And Deppe rushed up to me and he nudged me and he said, "This is what you learned in Toronto. This is what you learned from Leo." Of course, not only Leo, but also Greg and Sam and David and everybody else. But how, let's talk about uncompromising Marxism in the 90s or 2000s and how it was possible. My thesis is that for a long time, maybe even still today, we came to Marxism in very different ways when compared to, say, Brecht or Luxemburg or Lenin or even Marx and Engels themselves. Like Marx and Engels came to Marxism during what Hobsbawm called the Age of Revolution. So they observed the class struggles in France and connected them to their German philosophy and British political economy. Luxemburg and Lenin, they came to Marxism when capitalism developed, the class contradictions intensified, and the working class was already an organized mass party force. Even Engels in his testimony believed that there was a path towards parliamentary socialism, gaining more and more majorities, which Leo famously declared the end to. And Brecht, for instance, came to Marxism through the barbarism of imperialism and socialist revolution stretching from like a decade of socialist revolution stretching from Ireland to Central Asia. But what about left-leaning people today, like the kind of people like me or even younger people or that learned from Leo? Like from 1979 till 1989-91, essentially the three pillars of working class power in the world were wiped out. Being like the three pillars, working class power in the West, trade union power in the West, socialist, anti-imperialist, national liberation movements in the global South, and real socialism, state socialism, despite it all. And as you know, and as Leo famously analyzed, the first pillar was essentially wiped out, or the first two pillars were wiped out by the Volcker shock, by neoliberalism, essentially breaking the backbone of the working class domestically and forcing open the global South, or what would be the global South, to transnational capital, as Anna pointed out, being Sam's and Leo's biggest or best contribution. And then 1989 and 1991 killed the third pillar and further eroded what was left of the other two. So 89-91 was a counter-revolution and a deep crisis for all tendencies of the broad left, regardless whether they had harbored sympathies for real socialism or not. So pro-Soviet communists, Trotskyists, Maoists, social democrats, even social liberals and Greens, like all of their goals were put behind or were essentially harmed by what happened between 79 and 89. So today, we still are recovering from 40 years of neoliberal counter-revolution, and we live in, especially in the capitalist core countries, in what Klaus Dörre would call a demobilized class society. So in other words, capitalism does what it does best. Class society weighs heavier on the working class than ever in terms of wealth inequality, the wage share, union density, collective bargaining, social insecurity, and precarization. But we are still working on the revitalization of the labor movement that Leo and Sam have been working for and struggling for. And meanwhile, segments of the working class turn right. And of course, we have learned our lessons from progressive neoliberalism that on the one hand, the working class is not revolutionary in itself per se without a party, as Sam pointed out earlier. But we also have learned the lesson that there is no social progress or emancipation without or even against the working class, right? If you saw from the new social movements, as they came to power in essence in left neoliberalism, at a time when the working class movement was in a deep defensive position. And of course, as a result, we did not get eco-socialism, but we got carbon emission trading. We did not get social reproduction, socialization, for instance, like free daycare, etc., free care for the elderly, but we got politically correct language requirement, especially in the languages where it counts or where it works, like in the German language. So in other words, the working class is necessary for any kind of material social change when it comes to feminist interests or feminist demands, when it comes to ecological demands, etc. But nevertheless, what happened between 79 and 91 and afterwards essentially made it way more plausible to break with Marxism and to embrace new social movements, to embrace the enlightened middle classes or even the enlightened bourgeoisie, to at best pity the working class for being victimized by capitalism, or at worst not see it at all because of so much middle classism going on. So my thesis is, if Marxism is the theory and practice of the self-emancipation of the working class, then the new generation of socialists that are coming to Marxism now that we're living in the deep civilizational crisis, the Bernie Sanders campaign, through the Jeremy Corbyn, after Syriza, etc., they come to Marxism in many ways only through theory, but not the real lived observations of the economic and political class struggles, at least not from below. They're coming from above, but not from below. So one thing is, how do you become a Marxist? And the other is, how do you stay a Marxist? And this brings me to the unlikeliness and sheer overwhelming achievement of Leo Panitch and his legacy vis-a-vis the new, especially North American generation of socialists and Marxists. This legacy, in my view, is allowing Marxism to survive and to thrive. To survive a long period of counter-revolution. In essence, I would say, like Leo and Sam and all the others functioned like a message in a bottle for the 1980s till the 2010s. Like the message in a bottle metaphor is usually used for the Frankfurt School, allowing Marxism to survive its ideational and physical elimination through the Nazis after the 1930s, allowing it to survive until the 60s for a new generation to pick it up. And also allowing it, socialism or radicalism, to survive almost in a way that Marx and Engels allowed it to survive during the 1850s and 60s, because, as Brecht once wrote, one of the greatest deeds of the classics was that they predicted and lived through another upsurge of the exploiters and oppressors and bourgeois hegemony, but neither did their hatred for oppression and exploitation nor their determined will to overthrow them falter. So in that way, I think that Leo helped Marxism to survive, but he also helped Marxism to thrive. And Leo and Anna in particular has spoken to this or addressed this, because it's one thing to stick to principles. It's another thing completely to not turn into a stubborn dogmatic. And Anna mentioned or pointed out, and Sam did, what Leo's achievements with regards to state theory, with regards to class theory, and with regards to analyzing capitalism as globalizing capitalism, transnationalizing social production, and therefore shifting the way in which imperialism operates from inter-imperial rivalry to what essentially is an asymmetric ultra-imperialism. And that way, since I just yesterday did the broadcasting for the 150th anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg, I think that at best, Leo resembles Luxemburg in the same way that Luxemburg defended Marxism against Bernstein, like the Marxist tradition, but at the same time, so she helped Marxism to survive in her day and age in a way where it didn't need it as much as it does today. But she also helped it to thrive in the sense that she renewed it, both in terms of the relevance of mass action, both in terms of democratic socialism, democracy as a precondition for socialism, not only to manage a revolution, but also to outlast capitalism, to have a future. And secondly, both also in terms of imperialism, even though I agree with Leo's take on the limitations of Luxemburg's theory of imperialism. So this just to shine a light on the beacon of light that Leo was. There's more to say probably, but we can leave that to the discussion. One thing is that I would say that Leo not only helped, like that the counter-revolution that I spoke about lasted even longer than 79, at least ideationally amongst radical leftists. If you think of the First New Left by Stuart Hall, if you think of the fringe group strategies from the French structuralism, for instance, or the rien ne va plus in Frankfurt School thinking after 1945. And despite all of that, Leo stuck in believing in a class-based Marxism without romanticizing, as Sam Gindin pointed out, the working class, but pointing out to the need for a party, which I think I agree we need more than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all our panelists once again for just kicking this off in the right direction as we reflect on the life and work of Leo Panitch, an intellectual giant of the left. And I think now that we're moving into the discussion phase, we can even expand on some of those influences that he's had in our thoughts and our practice. And I think that a lot of people who are watching right now, a lot of people in the chat are really happy to have this engagement and are looking forward to expanding on some of these questions. So I'm just going to kick off with the first question from Jay, who says that, are the working class in the 21st century ready and prepared for all the teachings of Leo's work? Look at what the USA produced in 2016 and how the said individual is destroying democracy. I think he's referring to Trump. And is the world ready for Marxists? So I think I'll begin with you, Sam, if you'd like to take the question first, and then go in that order of our panelists according to the order in which they spoke. And you can just take 2 minutes each just to answer this question. Sorry, Sam, I think you're still on mute.
I don't think that's the right way to frame the problem. It isn't a question of whether the working class is ready or not. It's a question of the potential is obviously there. People are frustrated. You know, as Ingar said, the questions of there's permanent insecurity, there's growing inequality, there's the eco crisis. There's no shortage of reasons to want change. It used to be that the working class was bought off by the promise of steady progress. That ended. The answer to the working class today is tough. What are you going to do about it? They don't have to, it doesn't have to be legitimated in terms of buying them off. And that raises the question of what people think is possible, what people hope for, depends on what they think is possible. And what's possible depends on whether there are structures they can work through that can change the world. And the limits of unions and the limits of social democracy have left people feeling like there aren't structures that they can work through and change things. So they become cynical, they become fatalistic, they try to solve problems as individuals. They work longer hours, they go into debt, more family members work, and all of that actually reinforces neoliberalism without intending to. So the question, that the potential is there. We face an organizational question. And that organizational question is, can we once more embed ourselves in the working class? It isn't just a question of having some good policies or telling people what's needed. We're actually dying for a new kind of politics. It's an alternative politics that we need, that people can fight for. The working class has to be made, and it has to be made through structures that matter and can affect things. And that's been our failure. The biggest failure over the last few decades isn't that people lost wages or pensions, it's that their expectations were lowered because the sense of possibilities were lowered. And that's the challenge. So it's a challenge for all socialists to engage workers and to actually embed themselves in culture, in working class communities, because it's also a cultural question. And I probably extended my 2 minutes, so I'll stop.
No, that is fine. Thank you. Anna, you may go next.
Yeah, I want to, well, just go very quickly to Leo. Sam said that Leo was, Sam used the word, I miss it here, but Leo was very, sometimes Leo was very pessimistic. I remember when we were talking about a strike of Canadian workers against a Brazilian mining company, Vale, and after 11 months of strike, it was a huge strike. It built an international movement. We were organizing here in Brazil, and Canadians were organizing there, and Mozambicans. And then the result of the strike was not as good for the workers in Canada. And Leo was like, they lost the strike. So he was like somehow pessimistic. And I was arguing with him, well, They might have not gotten everything they wanted, but they no, there's something more than that. There is an education through the strike. There is a bigger movement through the strike. But it's still, he was right in the way that we were not strong enough to fight the very peculiar union between corporation and the state, be that the Brazilian state and the Canadian state. And this sort of pessimism came usually from his sort of lucidity. The word sober came always in Leo's talks. So sober analysis, have to be sober, don't have to rush to fast conclusions. And this was important for the, you're mentioning the US case, for Biden's campaign and Biden's election. I was translating one of his interviews right in the context of the US election too. And the person was asking him, should we as lefts, as socialists, make a campaign for Biden? Biden is actually our enemy, and he is. And Leo was, yes, we have to, because we have to get, we have to rebuild again the political space for socialist forces to act. And while Trump is in power, every door is closed and we won't have enough space to rebuild class, rebuild the working class. So this is the sort of thinking that Leo normally brings. And if you just let me one more minute, I think it's very important to really grasp how capitalism is structured itself and the capitalist class works structure itself to prevent working class organizing. You can see this very clear probably in South Africa too, but in Brazil, how firms and corporations, they build civil society institutions. They organize, some agendas of racial inclusion and for gender inclusion, but they keep the capitalist relations. If you see, if you take just one example of this week in Brazil, after over 200,000 deaths and a fascist in government, what we have here among this huge chaos and confusion is a group of entrepreneurs, a group of corporations organizing for vaccination and saying we have to have public vaccination in Brazil and we will organize this logistically. So this is the private sector, this is the corporations taking the public interest for them. And this is one example of how it is difficult to fight and to organize class in a context that the state becomes the enemy, becomes repression, becomes police, becomes military, and the capitalists, the corporations, the private sector gets to be the savior or takes the place of the public. So let me close here.
Inga, you may go.
Yeah, thanks, Awande. Well, to live, to struggle for an entire life, like over 6 decades at least, for a cause that is in a situation of counter-revolution, you have to have some sense of hope and optimism. And even though if you have pessimism of the intellect with regards to, say, for instance, the Brazilian struggle, you can have the optimism of the will. And for Marxists, I think it comes from somewhere. There's Franz Kafka once said that there's hope, just not for us. But I quoted Brecht twice, so I'm going to quote him thrice. He said, the contradictions are our hope. And we're currently living, through a deep civilizational crisis with at least 6 dimensions. It's not just the economy, it's not just social reproduction, deteriorating through austerity measures. It's not just social cohesion through digitalization and the social polarization that neoliberalism has produced. It's a crisis of democracy. It's a crisis of world order with rising China and the relative decline of the US. And of course, it's a crisis of the climate, the impending climate catastrophe. And on top of that, we can add the pandemic. So there's tremendous contradictions. And Sam said, we've the expectations of the working class have been lowered. But in essence, I mean, the last things that Leo could observe was not just, Syriza taking power, you know, like the left being able to take power after such a long time in Europe, but also the new generation of socialists in the United States. And I would argue that for many of them, like I totally agree with Sam that capitalism says tough luck, right? Like that they don't have to be bought off. But if they could, they would want to be bought off. I mean, with the Bernie Sanders campaign, like demands like the 50 minimum, like the federal 50 minimum wage, $15 minimum wage, free healthcare, free higher education, etc., are now demands that like even the right of the Democratic Party has to respond to, has to make a case why it can't be funded or why there's no majorities or whatever. They have 2/3 majorities across the US, all the three demands. And that's something to draw hope from, both from the contradictions as well as, and I think Leo did, from a new generation of socialists, which did not stop him from also saying that there's no shortcuts to revitalizing the labor movement or preventing a climate catastrophe. I remember when he was in Montreal, he said that we might have to build socialism in a world that looks like Blade Runner. And I think he was right. I mean, the counter-revolution that I spoke about was really deep and it is long-lasting. And the organizational work that the left has to do to root itself in the working class, as Sam rightfully put it, I think is a long-term struggle. But if we have Leo as our mentor, he struggled for a long time, so can we.
Thank you. I'll see, Sam, you have an input you want to make quickly?
Yeah, I just want to add something because it really is a difficult moment. Socialists almost always seem to have an answer. Often it was the wrong answer, but they felt comfortable because they had an answer. Either they thought they're going to form, since the Communist Manifesto, it was as if we formed unions, that would be the answer. And if we formed communist parties, if we formed socialist parties, and those answers failed to really deliver. And that has left, especially, recent generations, in a really difficult spot because we have to invent new answers. There's nothing to take off the shelf. And I guess I just would make 2 points. One is that we have to live as if socialism is possible. There's nothing else to do. So it's the as if socialism is possible is what has to define our life. We have to live as full a life as we can and live it as if socialism is possible. And then there's Ingar's point that there's just no instant gratification. This is a long-term process. And I think for most of us, we have to recognize that if socialism is going to come, we won't see it. It will be beyond our lifespan. And we have to have a sense that there's a sense of immortality in fighting for something that we actually won't see. And that's what we have to do. We have to contribute to the possibility of socialism down the road. We entitled our book, The Making of Global Capitalism, because it had to be made. And in making it, they also remade the working class in a particular way. And now we have to make a different kind of working class. And that's what is so central about the party question. It cannot be made spontaneously. Workers are too fragmented, too exhausted, too demoralized. And trade union leaders have gotten comfortable with telling their members there's nothing you can do. It's globalization. The lower expectations have made a lot of trade union leaders comfortable. It's easier not to raise expectations that you may not be able to deliver. So, that's what makes it so difficult. But the key question is, we need socialist parties that have feet in the labor movement and the movements and also outside of them. So they're not trapped by them and they can see beyond them. And it's this question of making a working class, which is not just difficult, but it's such a cultural phenomenon. It's something that gets made only after generations. So with generations of defeat, it's going to be longer term. And that's the challenge. And that was what was so beautiful and fantastic about Leo. He understood that. And of course, you have moments of pessimism, but he never gave up. And that's what he did. And even when he was in a hospital, he was still doing the same thing.
I just want us to end on this question, on this note, because we're going to pick up a lot of these themes in the next panel also. And just to expand on what Sam's just, the road that he's taken us on, this path of the party question and socialists having answers. I just want to just get a couple of inputs from Ingar and Anna before we wrap this session up and we continue with some of the other questions that have been brought up in our next panel. Anna, would you like to go next?
I was just think of one of the issues that Leo was discussing around class and around party in a broader sense, not the very specific electoral political parties. The way polarization also divided the left itself. We are talking about the polarization between militias and fascist groups on the one hand, and the Black Lives Matter on the other, in the case of the US. And Leo was bringing the issue of how also sorts of agendas. There are in fact left agendas, but they have been used and they have worked against the left itself, dividing the left, such as the identity question, such as the racial question and gender question. And that was very strong because we were all very hopeful when the Black Lives Matter movement rose in the US, that this could, bring us also something here within this huge chaos of COVID-19. And this week, just to get another example, there is a huge discussion and situation in South America, more specifically in Ecuador, which describes this division and the need to have a strategic agenda in the left, which is the election running in Ecuador between one candidate who is closer to this more developmental theory of the state needs to plan the economy, and the other, which is an indigenous candidate who has fought against the left government in Ecuador of Rafael Correa, and is against extractivism, against mining and oil exploitation, for the rights of the earth and so forth and so on. This kind of division exposes or makes clear how also the strategic agenda is not completely clear and not very pointed to a clear socialist future. Do we actually need to fight the state as a capitalist state, or should we take the state, a very old question, and how can we rebuild the state from the point of view of working classes who are not necessarily those traditional working classes? Those are working classes of an identical and ethnic type, for instance, in Africa and South America, etc. So these kind of discussions, I won't bring a concrete answer here, maybe we have more time later, is actually, I think, on the top of the day to fight a right wing in the world, which is also a little bit separate and split between the far right and the traditional neoliberal right, but it's still very strong. And it is so strong because the fascist right, they put forward the neoliberal agenda. They did it in the US, they're doing this in Brazil, and if we let them, they will take other governments in Europe and so forth. So the very question of strategy, I think, is on the top of the agenda for us.
Thank you, Anna. And now we'll finish off with Inga. I'm just looking at the time. We'll pick up a lot of these themes in our next panel. So I'll just give the final inputs to Inga. Thank you.
Yeah, I can actually pick up where Anna left off. I think that the situation is very dangerous. Like, I mean, we're in the fourth biggest crisis in the history of capitalism. since the long depression in the 1870s, 80s, the world economic crisis or Great Depression in the 30s, and the crisis of Fordism. And I would say that probably future historians will think of the global financial crisis and now the bioeconomic pandemic as actually a long-term crisis with upsurges, conjunctural economic ones, etc. of course. But so in all of these crises, we've seen the rise of the far right, which has is clear. In my view, Poulantzas was right when he said that it's not the strength of the left that produces or breeds fascism, but it's the failure of the left to produce a real experienceable alternative to the devastations of capitalism, and the vacuum that then is left in such a situation of deep civilizational crisis is filled by xenophobic, nationalist, and fascist answers. So it's a very tricky situation. But in the end, also when it comes to class and rebuilding class, I think even though Panitch drew a lot and reformulated things that Poulantzas said, I think where he really is superior to Poulantzas is that Poulantzas essentially defined the working class as merely the industrial working class in a very classic Marxist sense, namely the value producing class. But also we realize that there is, for wherever the value needs to be produced, and also value needs to be maintained or reproduced. And Leo was, I think, very important for overcoming the question of identity in the way that he defined the working class in his 2000 Socialist Register essay as an ethnicized and feminized class, so that the working class is essentially what we now term the multiracial working class. I think when US leftists now speak of the multiracial working class, they should pay tribute to Leo, because he was among those who predominantly theorized it in this way. And I think if we think of it in this way, we realize that the potential for socialism is always there, because the contradictions of capitalism are in operation, and the working class is, as Marx and Engels predicted, becoming a majority class, or is a majority class. And then, of course, we can talk about how to define, discuss the professional managerial class question, all those things. But in essence, I think there is always the potential for the working class, for socialism, because there is a class, a growing class, that has an objective, albeit not always subjective, without a political party interest in a socialist society. And I think that's something to draw optimism from.
I'd like to once again thank all our speakers today. Before we move on to the next panel, Sam Gindin, Anna Garcia, Ingar, Solty, just like to thank you once again for taking this time to share your thoughts and experiences with us. And I now hand over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Awanda, and thanks to our first panel. I hope you guys all stay, because at the end, in case you have anything else you'd like to add, I'll give you a very brief moment to do that. Okay, so now we are shifting to our second panel, and our second panel is on South Africa. We did kind of the international first, and the second is going to be on South Africa. I'm going to ask Vish, Dinga, and Patrick all to turn on your cameras, because I think it's quite nice for the audience to be able to see the panel of speakers. We can pretend we actually exist in a real world situation. Well, I guess we are in the real world, but in actually physical spaces together. Before I start, I just want to say just a personal note, because I think we all have used this. I mean, when we heard the tragic news, Vish and I immediately thought, oh my God, first after kind of reeling from the pain of it and the horror and shock, then immediately it was about hosting something like this. As one of the ways in which we can celebrate Leo's legacy, but also the enormous contribution that Leo and Sam, I have to say, when I think of Leo, I think of Sam and Leo. It's impossible to think of you guys separately. And I know Greg has also been a crucial part of your trio, a triad. But it's both of you guys that we think of, and we thought this would be one of the best ways to celebrate the legacy that you guys have had on us in South Africa, on the labor movement, and also your ideas and engagement with us. And you guys have both been incredibly generous in always coming to South Africa. I had the good fortune, we hosted Sam and Leo in 2016 And I think you guys said it was one of your busiest weeks ever. When we bring people from afar, we try to exploit you to the utmost. And we had lots of seminars. We wanted to expose you guys and your ideas to everyone we could in South Africa. You guys also traveled to Cape Town, and you were a huge hit. And I think it was really important. But you guys, your generosity has been incredible, and we really appreciate it. And that's why I think so many of us feel so emotional and saddened by Leo's passing, but we're glad you're with us and that you could be here today. So thank you very much, Sam, and to all of you guys, Anna, Inga, and our South African panelists. So Vish already introduced all you guys, but I'll introduce Vish in case people don't know who Vish is. Vish is a international relations scholar, political economy, global political economy scholar, and he's also an activist for many years. And he is a Marxist scholar, Marxist activist scholar, as are actually Patrick and Dinga as well. I think all with slightly different traditions and engagements. We have our constant battles and discussions that we love to embrace, but I think you'll get a rich understanding of Leo's and Sam and this entire tradition on the South African intellectual milieu. I also just want to say that today, now that this panel is going to focus, I think, both on Leo, perhaps with some anecdotes. I can imagine Dinga is one of the best storytellers I've ever known. So he'll probably have some nice stories about engagement with Leo, but we will also be engaging in his ideas, especially his Marxist ideas. So we agreed on a lineup, and the lineup is going to be Dinga, it's going to be Patrick, and then Vish. And I don't know, Jane, right now, Inga is pinned for my screen. Can you pin whoever is the speaker? Is that just me or is that everyone? So I'm just asking Jane.
Yeah, I think it's just you, Michelle, because I can see you on my screen.
Oh, is it me on? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might have to change your settings.
Okay, I don't know how to do that, but that's fine as long as everyone else, because I just want the speakers. Okay, thank you. All right, so each speaker, like the last time, is going to be given 15 minutes. If you have questions, please put them in the the chat bar, and I'll try to manage that as best I can. And then at the end, so we'll have 30 minutes for them to discuss the questions after their presentations. Okay, Dinga, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Thanks, Michelle, and thank you to COPEC for organizing this session where we can all remember Leo. I thought I will share a picture that I took at Leo's house in July 2018 in Toronto, when Michelle and Vish visited Leo, and I also thought that let me wear the same clothes that I wore on that day in 2018. And Leo presented me with his new book then, The Socialist Challenge Today. And I presented him with a CD of John Coltrane, what is called the Lost Album. Because over the years, besides the politics in the narrow sense, we had also discovered that we shared a common love for the politics of jazz music. And so it is really a great day to be here to talk about Leo. Now, I met Leo through the union, which is the National Union of Metal Workers, NUMSA, although I had read some of his work as a student. I do know that there are other NUMSA activists who are logged in, and some former leaders of the union. And what I'm going to do is to just talk about my sort of personal experience of that relationship between Leo and the National Union of Metal Workers, NUMSA. Now, if you ask NUMSA shop stewards, what is NUMSA's position on co-determination, competitiveness, what is their position or the union's position on worker participation? All of them will go to a resolution that the union took in 1996. And I just thought I will share that resolution because it has words that were borrowed from the exchange that we had with Leo and Sam and the delegation from the Canadian auto workers. On the issue of competitiveness, the union in 1996 resolved that yes, we do need as workers to be productive, but as a union, we do reject the ideology and proposals for competitiveness. I want to read everything. It said, instead of focusing on making our different companies' competitiveness, as a union, we should devise industrial policies that will lead to the development of our productive capacities. The next resolution of that Congress in 1996 was on workplace democracy. And in that, it raised the question of what was the attitude of the union to co-determination. And the union said, instead of getting involved in co-determination structures, we as unions and affiliates of the Federation and the Trade Union Center that would belong to then COSATU, we should fight for what is called extended collective bargaining, where we negotiate issues relating to production and issues which up to now have been regarded as management prerogative. Now, thank you, Jane. These two resolutions and the highlighted words came directly from the exchange that the union, NUMSA, had with the Canadian auto workers in 1995. Leo's association with NUMSA goes back to 1992, when the then General Secretary of the Union, Enoch Godongwana, traveled to Canada as part of an ANC delegation. On the side, he met John Sauls, and met Leo. And Enoch says he was introduced to Sam Gindin, who was then working in the president's office of the Canadian auto workers. And the relationship from then on began and developed. In May 1995, a delegation from the Canadian auto workers came to South Africa, and we had, I think, a 10-day exchange between CAW and NUMSA, where we looked at many questions. And what was important is that at that point, as the South African labor movement, we were faced with a number of questions. And through the discussions, we discussed, and I would like to highlight 4 questions. The first question was in relation to economic policy. As the labor movement, as workers, we were bombarded with the policy prescriptions that said that as South Africa, we needed to join in global competitiveness. We needed to ensure that South Africa was integrated into the global economy more. The second issue that was dominant at that point was about the nature of a rule or the form of rule. And in 1995 in South Africa, what was emerging was suggestion of a corporatist arrangement, social dialogue, the need for a pact between labor, business, and government. Thirdly, many of our companies were involved in workplace reorganization, and there were policy prescriptions for some form of co-determination. Fourthly, the question that preoccupied us as the labor movement was what should be the relationship between the labor movement and the ruling party. Now, all these questions were intensely discussed in the 10 days, and Leo participated together with the Canadian Auto Workers delegation in the discussion. A few months later, a delegation from NUMSA went to Canada, where they continued for 2 weeks the discussion that was started in South Africa. Now, what did we learn from Leo and his comrades? The first thing in relation to the pressure to be globally, to join in on global competitiveness, is that they emphasized that as workers, whilst it was important to build our productive capacities, we should be looking at questions of cooperation. And a good example of this cooperation at that point was our participation in the formulation of what is called the Southern African Power Pool, which was a cooperation between the power utilities in the region. That instead of each power utility in each country competing, it was important to be looking for complementarities. On the question of corporatism, Leo in particular gave us examples of how through this corporatist arrangement, the labor movement became agents in which it ended up disciplining the working class and its members. And the emphasis in the discussion was how we as the labor movement it was important to build external power. On the question of co-determination, looking at it historically and how it had emerged, the concept that you find in the resolution of 1996 of what is called extended collective bargaining is that instead of the labor movement trying to co-determine what happens in companies, it was important for the labor movement to redefine the agenda and extend its scope and take on issues that were historically had been management's prerogative. Fourthly, on the question of the issue of the relationship with the ruling party, many of us in the union were exposed, presented with the history between the Canadian labor movement and the New Democratic Party, the NDP, and how through that relationship, the labor movement became organizationally and politically emasculated. And I remember well that one of the readings that we had to do was the article that Leo had written, the NDP in Power, Illusions and Reality. Now, 1995, as I said, was an important year. And in many ways, as we were preparing for a Congress of NUMSA and the Congress of COSATU, many of the lessons and exchanges that we had with Leo and his delegation found expression in the resolutions that the union took. And many of them up to today are points of reference in what the unions stands for. Just to conclude, Michelle, in my discussion with Enoch Odongwane, who was then the General Secretary of the Union when this relationship started and who introduced to the Union Leo, what we underlined, both of us, and the qualities that we appreciated as a union in Leo was the question of generosity. Over a period, and I would mention, we had sort of sent unionist officials, shop stewards over for training. In fact, the current General Secretary of the Union, when he was a shop steward in the entire place, went over to Canada for political education that Leo and Sam had sort of organized. And one of the things that I think as a socialist and NUMSA in particular would want to take from the experience that we've had with the Leo is that if you are a socialist, you cannot be stingy. You've got to share what you have, and you have to be generous. And the two of us said that maybe through this interaction with Leo, we have seen what is called socialist generosity. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Dinga. Wonderful. Patrick, can you turn on your, okay, there you are, Patrick.
I think I'm with you, yes.
You are with us, thank you. So Patrick, you have 15 minutes and I'll be very strict.
That's good. In fact, I should say that I may have problems. I've got bandwidth problems and we've had electricity outages. I think, comrades, it's because, Dinga, you'll agree, we failed to have a socialist revolutionary takeover of ESCOM. And as a result, it's corporatized, inefficient, corrupt, instead of what we'd hoped Leo and Sam could invoke in NUMSA, that is the electricity system. So I'm just excusing myself in advance if there are problems. I really wanted to very quickly say in 2-3 minutes each that this experience that we've had in South Africa extends beyond this amazing record that Leo and Sam had with NUMSA. We'd, of course, had Judith Marshall from the Steelworkers. But when I moved to the city, Johannesburg, 31 years ago, I was already being primed by the Toronto independent left, in which Leo and Sam are just two of the critical components historically, because John Saul also laid the ground for extraordinary thinking through what kind of politics. So let me hit political strategy, and then just quickly mention capitalist crisis and limits to the crisis displacement tendencies. Third, as Anna mentioned, deglobalization and delinking as a political strategy. And fourth, where we came together, sub-imperialism as a concept, and fifth, ecology. May not be time. But anyway, the point is, to start here in 1992, yes, it was definitely the Enoch Godongwanas, or maybe also Moses Maikiso. And what Maikiso, a leader of NUMSA, but also a leader of the civic movement, did was to draw Leo and Sam, I don't know if you'd remember it, Sam, into an extraordinary debate where the independent left that weren't in the unions were trying to grapple with the post-Fordist fantasies of some of, yes, the NUMSA leaders, right? The ones Dinga would say were influenced by the Australians, right? There was Australians here and Canadians on the left. You know, it was extraordinary debates that we were having in '92. And again, John and Saul, Judith Marshall, would have to add Carolyn Bassett and Marlia Clark, who worked with them all. I think they had that great phrase, class struggle or class snuggle. And it was, of course, the latter that unfortunately won the day with the corporatist politics. Another great Canadian of the era who stuck with us in that period, David Moore, is at University of Johannesburg. You know what Leo did? Writing with Ralph Miliband that year, he said three things that have always stayed with me for political strategy. And you'll know these phrases very intimately, won't you, everyone? We need an approach distant both from ultra-leftism on the one hand and from the politics of accommodation of social democracy on the other. That needs to be elaborated and developed and given clear and relevant short-term and longer-term policy, meaning institutional focus. What a great laboratory to do that ideological work on non-reformist reformism, as John Saul using Andre Gortz, and you know, Leo and Sam had all kinds of ideas. So second, for example, the approach entails an involvement in immediate struggles over a multitude of current issues. So it's not just workerist and point of production. In the current moment of economic crisis, the most important must be bold programs for economic recovery oriented to employing people directly in the expansion and improvement of the public infrastructure and basic needs goods in a context in South Africa of apartheid, phasing out. So that's the second of the Saul and Miliband recommendations from that year's Socialist Register. The third, no such program will allow one country to escape by itself from the economic crisis. The program could mitigate the effects of the crisis and lay the basis for a more ecologically sound, socially just, productive economy in the future. It would contribute to giving people a sense that something can be done about the crisis, the key to popular mobilization in even more radical directions. I think those components are what many of us in the independent left, I mean, Vishwas, Michelle, Dinga, you'd agree, these are so central to the way we've carved out a kind of independent left politics. But there's some nice friction. So secondly, capitalist crisis. You know, I remember 2004, I think, Sam, the Empire seminar that you played such a great role in, where Leo invited David Harvey, my PhD supervisor, and this was a contest of, do you see capitalism from above with the logic and laws of motion of capital determining the course of events? Or do you see the central pivot of history as, you know, from below, the class struggle? Leo, the latter. David Harvey, the former. And of course, that's the bias, you know, you carry our baggage, so that's my bias. And yet, so in this amazing book, right, this, I hope everybody's, you know, kind of got your copy. I know there's pirate copies online, you can find it. Such a great book where Leo and Sam do acknowledge capitalism is inherently crisis prone. Its deeper internationalization with finance playing such a prominent role adds to its volatility. But capitalism will not fall apart because of inter-imperial rivalry, the conflict between financial and industrial fractions of capital, the domestic impasse between nationally and internationally oriented bourgeoisies, or any ahistorical working out of the law of profit. So they're very clear. And who can dispute that? I mean, that's absolutely right. The making of global capitalism began at home. Its unmaking, Leo and Sam say, will depend on the creation of a working class in each country with the capacity to carry through that unmaking. Yes, absolutely. But you know, the debate there was, let's say, the next level of the nuance. Is capitalism weak because the working class was in retreat, 2004? Or, I'm sorry, capitalism is strong, right? That was what was being argued so strenuously by Sam, by Leo. Or is it weak because of the tendencies to crisis? And the 2001 dot-com crash was just one of those sort of indications. And to that, I would have argued, and still do, over accumulation tendencies in capitalism with the rising organic composition of capital and overproduction. ruinous competition, and the failure of countervailing tendencies. From Das Kapital, it's usually the working out of productive forces in the relations in relative surplus value with more machinery, or extreme capitalist expropriation through absolute surplus value. And Harvey did bring some crisis management, additional countervailing tendencies like moving the problem across space, moving it through time using finance, or using Luxembourg, the accumulation by dispossession, imperialism. And I think that's going to be continuingly important as a way to debate. So I just loved it that Leo and Sam just really took that on and said, this overaccumulation theory isn't working. The only place it works to explain 2007 and 8 meltdown is in overaccumulation has been a factor, as they say, in generating the crisis, but very specifically located in the interface between the construction industry and real estate finance. Okay, so we're going to leave that one on the table to continue to debate, but it does generate the question of deglobalization after that period. That is, all of the ratios, trade to GDP, FDI to GDP, cross-border lending to GDP, are all starting to retreat from their highs of 2007. And the final point here really is that delinking is one of the more logical responses if there's no longer the export-led growth fantasies to portray because of this delinking. And yet Leo, and here he's in a debate with David Harvey in 2015, and it's on video, you can find it. It's suicide to pull out of the world market at that point, 2015. And yet in 2020, Harvey reverses. Now, the reason I'm giving you this as a sort of framing of a friction and a dialectic is because my last discussion with Leo, he was so generous with, providing feedback and always replying to emails, Sam as well. And it was October 21, a couple of months before he passed on. Hi, Patrick. Sorry not to have replied earlier. And then he goes into this wonderfully long, detailed analysis about why, if you do want to take this route, the route from Samir Amin, Mauro Marini, with the sort of strategies that come from Brazilian dependency, what he's arguing, he says, is very explicitly, you need to have a party, you need to have a state, you need to be able to make sure your working class makes this a socialist orientation to delinking, and the context of deglobalization helps, but it's not going to make your case. I mean, I'll put this down somewhere on paper because I'm sure he wouldn't have minded me spreading his wisdom. He won that debate. He also was generous with Anna and me in thinking through when the G20 formed in 2008 to try to band-aid out that big financial meltdown, in thinking through how the G20 gets incorporated, all these new countries, not just G7, G8, but the likes of South Africa. And so we pose that sub-imperialism from Marini, also from Harvey, is a useful way to bring this together. And it was so wonderful to work with him over this period, a great set of seminars in 2016. And his view that imperialism had this capacity to assimilate the G20 elites and to make the multilaterals, very much part and parcel of an imperial sub-imperial alliance, was contrary to the optimism of the era when the BRICS was coming up. And we loved working with him on that. I'll leave ecology to another time because that was a contentious one, but I'm sure I'm out of my 15 minutes. So thanks very much. Viva Leo, viva, long live the spirit of Leo Panitch, long live.
Thanks, Patrick. You're actually a bit early, so that's great. More time for discussion, but thanks very much, Patrick. Okay, so next, Vish, you're on 15 minutes. I'll be strict.
Thanks. So like Leo, I think it's important that we build capacities as we have these conversations. So I'm a PowerPoint Marxist, if you like, as we learn together. So I'm just going to kind of reference in sort of 3 pieces of work as we engage here today. Class Theory for Our Time, which appeared in Catalyst. It was based on a talk that Leo gave in Argentina. The Socialist Challenge Today, which he co-authored with Sam, and Renewing Socialism, Democracy, Strategy, and Imagination. So, we've been kind of trying to position Leo in the context of left politics. I think the earlier panel was also wrestling with that question. But Leo was definitely about being to the left of democracy. And he understood very explicitly the limits of using parliamentary majoritarianism to bring about social transformation. And in a lot of his work, he studied the left thrusts of social democracy, the Maidner Plan of 79, Tony Benn in the 70s, Mitterrand in the 80s, and even some of the left currents in Eurocommunism, particularly in their work on Syriza. But I want to add that there was also an experience in the global South, which is also important for all of us to reflect on. Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 toppled in a CIA coup, a radical redistributive program. 1959 in Kerala, India, the Communist Party, India Marxist, comes to power with the Democratic Socialist Program, but liquidated by Nehru. 1973, Salvador Allende, CIA coup, and so on. And up to the present, you know, you had Chavez and you had the movement for socialism in Bolivia, all with their contradictions, all with their limits. But I think it's important that we also grapple with those experiences. And Leo, in his method and understanding of Marxist politics, was about learning from history. He was always concerned about the technocratic gap between leaders and led and the distance from the working class. It was central to his critique of social democratic politics. So on the one hand, you had sort of a position to the left of social democracy, which some of us have always held as well in the South African context. On the other hand, Leo was critical of Leninist vanguardism, and he understood that it was dogmatic. It was about a formulaic politics. It engendered a populism and an opportunism. And that also comes out in how he reflects on how this politics travels and expresses itself and so on. But he wasn't averse to learning from the Russian Revolution, and particularly evoking the idea of a spirit of revolution from Marx. At the same time, and others have made the point, learning from Luxemburg's critique of the Leninist model and the direction that the Russian Revolution was taking, the clique affair, if you like, of degenerating revolutionary politics, and also very much in lockstep with Gramsci around what is relevant to the Western context. So in South Africa, we have had a naive social democratic current historically, even mutated and in our post-94 period, imbibing sort of third way social democracy and so on. We also have the dogmatic Marxist-Leninist Trotskyist types in South Africa, again, formulaic, not open to thinking, etc. And you have, of course, a fading revolutionary nationalism. So all these projects are exhausted. And it's in that context that we have to sharpen our critique of these projects. And for me, this is where the democratic Marxism project is very, very important for our conversations in South Africa and as part of the global left. So yes, somebody asked about class analysis, and it was very, very clear in Leo's work that he didn't, he was clear about the defects in Marxist theory. And I suppose like Lukács understood that method was important in Marxism, and you find Marxist answers to contemporary questions. And so, you know, his empirical premise was that there's more workers on planet Earth today than at any other point. But he was also willing to look afresh at what was happening to class structures and the labor process in the world, in national accumulation processes and so on. But he was also willing to look vertically, not just at the working class and its making from below, but what was happening to ruling classes. That was very, very important. But coming out of this analysis was the need to build forms of working class organization relevant to our times. And I think this is a very, very important question, and it has featured in our conversation. At the same time, as a rigorous Marxist, Leo positioned himself against a kind of banal and a facile identity politics, which is the flavor of the month in populism today. That doesn't mean he wasn't sensitive and tolerant to identities. He has a clear sensibility around this in his work. But like Marx, he was very, very aware of oppressions. Marx was aware of oppressions. He was aware of human exploitation, of slavery, of colonialism, of imperial nationalism, and the destruction of our life-sustaining commons. So Marx was a thinker against oppression, and Leo, in my view, maintained that premise and preoccupation even in the socialist register. Now, talking about social strategy, I mean, Patrick alluded to this, and I think I've set the scene for us to recognize that Leo wasn't enamored with narrow electoralism, and neither was he enamored with insurrectionary strategies. And yes, he did wrestle with Andre Gors and the classic text Strategy for Labor, penned in 1964, and this notion of non-reformist reforms and structural reforms. So Patrick invited us to unpack this. And for Leo, this was about going beyond a class compromise politics. And Dinga's presentation affirmed that for us. It was beyond the supply side competitiveness agenda that came through thick and fast, even inside the labor movement, the Industrial Strategy Project, including in the ANC state and so on. Leo was all about keeping the space open for ongoing struggles. It was about building capacities and institution building in the context of, if you like, structural reforms or non-reformist reforms. And the state was crucial. The transformation of the state was crucial from the strategic perspective, because Leo was very alive to the pushback from capital. Now in South Africa, we haven't got it all worked out, but one of the concepts that we've been developing is the idea of democratic systemic reforms. And it's a concept that we've been using in our solidarity economy work, in food sovereignty campaigning work, in the climate justice charter we've developed, and so on. And it's really about thinking through a constitutive form of mass and class power from below. It's about decarbonizing and pushing against carbon capitalism and building democratically controlled systems to sustain life. And I think this for us is a very, very important strategic and conceptual framework to clarify the kind of direction we're moving around socialist strategy in South Africa. Now, class party and the kind of challenge around democratizing the state has come up as well. But I think the crucial insight we must take away from Leo when he was thinking with and against Marx in some ways was that for him, the working class was able to play an essential role in history because of its capacity to organize. And this is the point we must take away even today in our conversation. If we do not organize and build, we will perish. I mean, many have alluded to the rising fascism and so on our planet, the ecological crisis, etc. This is a fundamental issue for Leo, organizing. And so this is where the party becomes very important and the political form of the party. And Leo wrestled with this both in his historical reflections of socialism, but also in his attempts to grapple theoretically with this idea. And I don't think he fully resolves the questions, but he does pose very important issues. The question of leadership, the links to mass forces, political education, ongoing, build capacities from below, particularly if you want to keep the space open for deepening struggles. But central, as I said, to Leo's conception of strategy was transforming the state. And for Leo, democratizing the state was very, very fundamental, and remaking state institutions. And I think this comes out in some of the empirical cases that him and Sam reflect on, and I'll come back to that just now. But it's in this context that different forms of ownership become very, very important. At the same time, solidaristic democratic planning. And so Leo stood against this co-determination thrust coming out of Germany, but recognized that there is another tool that is within reach that can take capital from capital. Now, in the South African context, transformative politics is the kind of conceptual frame in which some of us grapple with this question, with, against, and beyond the state. So the idea is not to end up in a state-centric place, because that's the dogma of the South African left. It's all nationalized, and that's the beginning and end of politics. But actually, it's about learning to build capacities from below around the transformative thrusts that need to lead us to the next society: solidarity economy, food sovereignty, and the systemic alternatives for the deep just transition. And here the commons is very, very important. Now, this issue of the return of democratic socialism, or I would say democratic eco-socialism, was also very important in their work. In the most recent book, The Socialist Challenge, they really tried to locate Syriza, Coben, and this in historical terms is very, very important, because it's after almost 4 decades that you had a discourse around socialism coming to the fore in the centers of capitalism. And of course, there's a nuance in the analysis that, this wasn't happening post the Great Depression, where frameworks were discarded and there was space for something new, or the early 70s and so on. Neoliberalism still lives in our midst and in our present. I want to also add that I think that from where I'm located, this shift towards socialism also began in the global South as well in the early 2000s. So I think what's central in the inquiry is what is coming to the fore. Is it the renewing of social democratic parties or a new generation of left parties? And it's in that context that they engage with, if you like, the resurgence of a socialist discourse and asks very, very critical questions about the programmatic limits of these political projects, the strategic dilemmas at the heart of these projects. So there's no straight line to make history. It's complex. And of course, the institutional weaknesses. And they're constantly posing the question, what can we learn from this? Which I think is very, very important. And so at the heart of their engagement with the rising tide of socialism or democratic socialism is the shift from protest to institutional politics. And I think this is a very, very fundamental question for us in South Africa. In South Africa, we have begun long conversation. Some of it started in the South African Communist Party, when some of us were there as democratic socialists, around going beyond the Soviet imaginary, but have continued that project to think about democratic eco-socialism as a project for our time. And our climate justice charter in South Africa is a very, very important mooring for that. But linked to that is the question of a mass left party. And we've had, if you like, possibilities in South Africa. The South African Communist Party was one of those possibilities, at least for my generation. And it's very, very important to interrogate why that possibility never materialized. The other possibility was the NUMSA moment. And again, hard questions need to be asked about that moment. But I do think there's an objective case to be made for a mass left party in South Africa today. And many people have, if you like, made the points about the context, etc. But it's a question that has to be owned by the left. Not one individual, not one theorist, not one ideologue in South Africa can resolve this question. It's a question that we all have to be seized with and grapple with and to find an answer to. Related to this is the political form of such a party. What form should it take? And there's a lot to learn, as I said, from the different waves of democratic socialism in the 20th century. You have the party movement form, you have the connective party form debated on the left, etc. But is there something else? I mean, Fanon talks about the people-driven party. And maybe we are in a context where we need to conceive of the citizen movement party. It's a concept, it's an idea. It hasn't been born yet. It hasn't been invented by the left. But given the context that we are in with brittle democracies and the structural power of capital, there's something here that we have to interrogate around the political. Of course, we have to think about the strength and orientation of mass forces to lead the deep, just transition from below. I'm going to end now and giving the last word to Leo. And he's, in my view, steadfast to the end. And taken from his book, Renewing Socialism, many people on the left who feel despondent today and take seriously the talk about the death of socialism are only acknowledging that their death is likely to come before socialism does. But socialism need not come in our lifetime for us to be politically relevant as socialists. The point of socialist politics is about ordinary people developing themselves through the process of engaging in political life. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vish. My panel was very disciplined. Thanks, guys. You were all very disciplined with your time. Okay, there was just a few questions. I'm gonna just ask you guys all, and anyone, and actually I'll give you each a chance to respond. One is, Vish touched on this, but I think it'd be nice to have more, because the question came up about the relationship between party and movements, or party and unions. And, you know, if you guys could elaborate a bit more in reflecting on, not on your own views, but on what you learned from Leo in this regard. Vish, I'm asking you to take it a bit further, maybe talking a bit more about what Leo, just in conversations with Leo about Ceresia or other places. And then there was also a question, Dinga, I actually want you to answer. There's a comment, it's not a question. Some of these are, almost all of these were actually comments, about hearing you talk, the real sense of how much has been lost And if you can actually reflect on this a bit more as well, because you actually had the unbelievable good fortune of engaging and encountering Sam and Leo in the 90s in NUMSA, and then again in 2016 in NUMSA, and throughout that period as well. So if you want to just reflect a bit more on some of the main things you think have been lost. And then there was some comments about kind of Leo, how did Leo understand some of the concrete attempts to de-link in the world over the last few decades? And if any of you know if he's engaged at all issues around, I think this would be around land and issues around Zim or other places in Africa. And then I want to take advantage of being chair and just ask you guys, I mean, at least from my experience of hosting Leo and Sam and hearing them give so many amazing talks, there were quite a few times where, Leo's encyclopedic and synthetic kind of knowledge of Marxism was just blew me away, and so I want to ask each of you if you can mention one of those moments that you had with them, either in a personal engagement or in hearing him speak, about something that he said or did in the way he did it, the way he said it, and reflecting his broad, sweeping understanding of Marxism. Okay, I'm going to go. Oh, I'll give Vish a chance to. So Petra, I'm going to start with you, then I'll go to Vish, and then I'll go to Dinga. I'm just mixing it up a little bit.
That's fine. Well, okay. I mean, there's so much there that my dear comrades are going to be much better equipped to talk about. Hibbis was asking about whether Cuba was on Leo's radar as a delinking exercise, where the integrity of an economy first tied to the Soviet Union, and then after 1990 untied and really delinked. And for example, this segues into the next point I'd like to make. It had to go renewable and into organic farming because of the lack of fertilizer and the basic change in fossil fuels. This was in a way the just transition. I do remember talking to Leo about that. Hibbis was also asking about Zimbabwe. I don't know if he had any views. Perhaps Sam can or others in the house can help us, because Zimbabwe was a case of a classic Frantz Fanon story of a post-colonial elite that couldn't accumulate because of both settler capitalist lock-in of all of the systems of capitalist power and also global capitalism, which left Zimbabwe by the mid-80s in a debt crisis like all others. And so for Mugabe to then in 2000, after all efforts to move first against global capital and then with it in structural adjustment, fail to deliver, fail to create a new black bourgeoisie, primitive accumulation, as David Moore, who's really the expert on this, said in. And I don't think Leo would see anything useful in that experience for the left. Of course, the question there is, did sanctions, especially the US Zadera Act, which was a kind of delinking, but mainly from international finance. See, the thing is already Mugabe had defaulted on debt, so he wasn't going to be getting any new loans anyway. So I think that's just slightly off of where Leo would see, a powerful working class movement demanding a different relationship to the world economy. The kind of critique of progressive competitiveness post-Fordist strategies that were coming from the right wing of NUMSA, the Alec Irwin group around, sort of promoting high tech and post-Fordist quality circles, all the things you all remember from the early 90s that were miserable failures. And then coming to whether the next period of demands over a genuine eco-socialist just transition. You see, the dilemma there was, like with what Leo said, I gave you a good quote from Leo and Sam about how you can't really expect crises in capitalism to end capitalism. You need the working class to give that critical push. And likewise, there was a concern in Leo's work that too much eco-catastrophism, right? So there's your question, I suppose, Michelle, where's this Marxist insight? And there's a more nuanced debate, and someone like John Bellamy Foster, also out of that Toronto left originally, made very good cases. I think many in the House would agree. We are looking at the ecological breakdown that capitalism cannot fix using the tools that it has available to, internalize externalities, financialization, the privatization of the air, all of those kind of things Leo could certainly relate to, but I don't think he, until indeed last year, David Harvey either, would accept that there was eco-catastrophism. So he then did, in his correspondence with me 2 months before he died, make more of the Green New Deal as a vehicle. He was very enthusiastic about that. So those of you perhaps from the Toronto scene where you have the LEAP manifesto and all of the, the work that the good Green left has been doing. But I think maybe the last point is that's not yet ready, is it, in the kind of eco-socialist party building? Because certainly not the Canadian Greens and Social Democratic Party and efforts, I think, that Leo would always say he desperately wanted to see that party. He worked really hard to make it happen in Toronto. He gave advice to comrades around the world trying to make that kind of party happen. But as Sam said, it might not be in our lifetime. But the groundings from Leo, from Sam, from all of you good comrades in Toronto and all over that were part of this family, those will be vital.
Thanks, Patrick. Just for our international audience, those were Hadidas screaming in the back of Patrick. We once had an international person, children screaming. Those aren't children screaming, they're Hadidas.
Hadidas is a really big bird that's
giant birds, yeah. Right? They're very funny looking. Yeah. Okay, Vish, I want to add on to the point about the party, because there's a few questions around that. And one, talk about what the working class role in the citizen movement party, and also how does one think about this within the context of the national question never having been resolved. Okay, so Vish.
Thanks. So I agree with Leo and Sam about their observations regarding the resurgence of socialism. So if you look at the US context, a very class-focused discourse, as they say, with Bernie Sanders and so on, but not class-rooted. So there's less than 10% of the US working class organized in the US. And, there's a history to this and what has happened, say from the interwar years where industrial unions were very powerful versus where we are now in the present. And so this idea of class rootedness, I agree with, and I think it's very, very important even for the South African context. If there's a left political project that's going to lift off, it has to think about how to locate itself within the working class. Now, our unions are in disarray, and we've got to be asking the question, what happened? In the 80s, COSATU at least had a bit of the strategic initiative on the left. We come out of that in the context of neoliberalization, et cetera, and we're seeing the fragmentation and so on. We're seeing the precariatization of the working class, et cetera. So are unions the pathway to locate within the working class? I think is a very important question. I still think unions are important and relevant, but we need to rethink the kind of unionism we have in the South African context. Actually, Sam has written some interesting work on this. But I also think that beyond the organized working class, we have to also think about pathway into the precariat and beyond, permanently unemployed in our society. I think that that's very, very important. In our work around food sovereignty, solidarity, economy, that's where the lived experience of South Africa's working class, if you like, informs our politics. So we may not be validated and we might be seen as reformist by, say, Irvin Jim and so on. But for us, we are trying to find an organic connection in the lived experience of the working class. And I think this is very, very important for the kind of political formation that needs to be constructed if it happens in South Africa. At the same time, I think it's also important to recognize other oppressions in our society. And this relates to Mandla's question as well. Yes, we do have an unresolved national question. But I think from the standpoint of climate justice, I think what's very, very important is we have to locate the question on new ground. The climate contradiction is the most dangerous contradiction we face as a species. And we have to place this question front and center. And I would argue the fundamental question is the ecocide question today. And if we are going to address, if you like, the injustices of the past, We've got to do it with that, through the prism of that question. And that's what the Climate Justice Charter is all about. It's about an emancipatory ecology. It's recognizing the land dispossessions, it's recognizing the super exploitation of the past, etc., but recognizing that with more climate shocks, the working class, the poor, the vulnerable are going to be hurt the most. They face the greatest harm. And so as we go down the path of a deep, just transition, the content of that deep, just transition has to be democratic, eco-socialist in South Africa. And today we issued a statement against the State of the Nation address of the South African president, making these points very, very sharply. Thanks.
Thanks, Vish. You didn't ask my question about your memory of an engagement with Leo, but you can later. Dinga.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. Let me just say, the interactions with Leo, the first one at intense level was in '95. And then him and Sam came to South Africa again in 2016 and had a seminar with NUMSA. And I see some of the comrades from NUMSA are reflecting on that on the chart. And I also had an opportunity to spend some time with them in Cape Town, where they spoke about their book on global capitalism. And then we again connected in Toronto in 2018. Now, so maybe unlike other people who've been sort of on a sort of ongoing discussion and how the ideas of Leo are shifting, are concretizing, there are these sort of episodic interactions, and then they are intense for that moment. But the fact that there was an annual socialist register, it meant that although you are not in touch or you're keeping in touch with him, there was a way of, touching base with the editorial when he introduces that. And if, Michelle, you're asking something that will be lost, it is that touching base through the editorial on an annual basis. Sure, the Socialist Register will continue, but over time, for some of us, it was a way of just touching base. So I would say that for me is something. Now, I mean, we had a discussion because Leo would, in many ways, would interrogate about what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in the Union, and what's happening in NUMSA, what happened to this and what happened to that. And I also thought, look, let me ask him what's happening in Canada and his political involvement. And I got him to talk about the socialist project. This is now outside of the academy. And I was struck by the humility on the socialist project. There was no, he just said, look, this, the socialist project is, he gave me the numbers of how many people and how they connect up, but there was no big claim that this was now the organization. And what I understood, this was a way of socialists keeping in touch, socialists somehow exchanging ideas, and without making any extraordinary claims. Now, this is for me important because for many years, and I've been around for some time, the ease at which a breakthrough and a turning point are declared is so familiar. And I just thought from an organizational point of view, that is a humility that for me was important. We did have some discussion, and I wouldn't be the person to conclusively say about the party question, and I mean what I got from Leo is that as Sam was saying, the issue of how the party is central in the sort of remaking of the working class is something that was close to Leo. And he had a problem with the parties, the sort of 20th century communist parties, social democratic parties, and I think that came up in the NUMSA seminar in 2016. I was, it's a pity that he's gone now. I've become much more critical of parties, that as the left, parties have presented us with problems than solutions. And that the party question has to be rethought again, both as an instrument, because the examples that we have and the innovations that we've had haven't really broken from the fact that the parties are creating these. So in our discussion in Cape Town, there was an unsatisfactory explanation in that. But clearly, this is a question that we need to pick up ourselves in going forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Dinga. We only have 5 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of time, especially it's Friday night for many, and I know that this is a tough evening. So I don't know, there was a question around like, how do we engage the pandemic? There was, Dinga kind of answered that. There was a question that basically said, parties have been in power over the 20th century and they never changed the world. I think Dinga already kind of spoke about this. I want to give all the panelists, anybody who has one last comment they want to make, but I'm going to ask you to be ruthlessly brief with your time. So 30 seconds. And you don't have to speak, but if anybody would like to say one last kind of comment, please, maybe just let me know, raise your hand. Vish, I think you probably want, okay, so I know Vish, okay. Anyone else want to say one last thing? Sam, okay. And so Patrick and Dinga don't have their videos on, so I can't see you if you're raising your hand. Okay, Anna, you want to say something too? Okay, I'm going to act, you're okay, you want to say something, Anna? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to let Anna go first, and then I'll let, I can let Vish go, and then I'll have Sam go, and I'm going to take it that both Patrick and Dinga are fine, and Ingar is also fine. Okay, so Anna, why don't you just say something as brief as...
I think that Sam raised his hand before me, but if Sam doesn't mind, I'm not.
Yeah, just go ahead. Just go ahead. Go ahead.
30 seconds. Just want to stress again my gratefulness, how happy I am to be here. Leo has been really, I'm very personally involved. Leo has been really important for me as a person in my formation. I think that me and Ingar, like we are the generation of his PhD students from different places in different contexts, but 3 words really describe is generosity, is sobriety, and now Dinga just brought the word humility. I think this is really important, and I want to stress just the last word. no matter how important Leo's ideas were to everyone's formation, the very way that he dealt with students respectfully, with other persons who were, you know, more simple than him, the very way that he dealt with these people were, for me, the way that he would teach us how to be socialists in our everyday lives. So I just want to end with this and really thank you so much again.
Thanks, Anna. I can't remember. I think I said Vish next.
Yeah.
Vish,
yeah, thanks. I just one quick point. I mean, when Langazita and I interviewed and engaged with Leo, I think it was in 1999, December. What was striking in our engagement with him was that he was unabashed about how he saw, if you like, national liberation politics as being exhausted. And he was even willing to say, you know, the trade union movement must end its relationship with the ANC. And I think for me, it wasn't just him on that journey that was saying that. You know, it was Samir Amin. It was many Marxists that we met along the way. And I don't know when the South African left is going to come to a realization that there is a need for a post-national liberation politics in South Africa. Thanks.
Right, you leave with a bang. Okay, Sam. Sam, I think you're, you have to unmute yourself. Sam? Okay. Sam? Oh yeah, sorry, great. Thanks.
Yeah, no, the discussion is so great that it's just tempting to get into everything. The time scale of the ecological movement versus the time scale of capitalism, the question of new forms of working class organization, which I'd really like to get into. I guess I just want to add with not only thanking you, but emphasizing how much we got out of the conversations with people in South Africa, you know, Vish and Michelle, and just thinking through, you know, all the questions that you're raising that are particular to South Africa, but not just particular to South Africa. They force us to think so much about so many other things. And the inspiration of South African workers whose level of consciousness was so high. And I actually just found it tragic in terms of how do you sustain these things? Because the question of party isn't just about making something, it's also about sustaining something. And I do want to say, Vish raised the question of Leo and history, and I think Ingar did too. Leo really took the historical in historical materialism seriously, which was very important. Anyways, I could just go on for a long time, so I'm just going to stop. Thank you so much, and I hope we can continue some of these discussions.
Thanks, Sam. We will definitely take you up on that. You should know there's an open invitation. We'd love, when post-pandemic, whenever that would be, we will bring you back if you ever want to come back again. Otherwise, we could do it in this new techno world that we live in. Okay, so I'm going to give the vote of thanks. I'm going to first say today's seminar, kind of contribution, celebration of Leo is, as Vish said at the beginning, it's part of our Democratic Marxism seminar series. We started this in 2013, and I'm very proud that it continues to go. Some years have been more than others, where we could host more people, obviously, compared to last year. But it's actually also, as I was thinking about this today, it's also very sad. Some of our kind of leading lights have passed away. Samira Amin passed away. We were going to bring Marta Honecker, and she was very keen to come, but she got sick and couldn't, so she passed away. Now Leo's gone. Eric Olin Wright spoke on the Democratic Marxism series. He's gone. And it's, Vish and I have spoken about this quite a bit. It's quite scary and sad. Some of our most important Marxist scholars, thinkers, activists, and politically committed people that we could always look up to aren't here. So, I think it's really important that we carry on the tradition. I think it's more important than ever if we want to respect their legacies. I also want to just thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. They have been a stalwart supporter of the Democratic Marxism series, including this, and a lot of Vishwas' work and Kopac's work. So thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. They really are, I think, one of the organizations living in up to the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg. So thank you to them. The Socialist Register was mentioned a few times, but I think it is important to mention it again because it really has been a hugely important thing for people around the world. And many of us who didn't know the Sams and Leos and Gregs, we knew the Socialist Register, and it was a hugely important beacon. And so I hope that continues. Even though Dinga said it's not going to be, we're not going to be able to get kind of eavesdrop in what Leo's thinking at any moment in time, it still is an incredibly important resource for the world. I want to also thank our speakers, all of them, Dinga, Inga, Anna, Vish, Patrick, Sam, and especially Anna and Sam. It's a big time difference, so thank you for getting up early. And also, I guess I should say the others, it's a later than usual on a Friday afternoon. So thanks everyone for accommodating this weird time difference. But it's wonderful, and you guys were all fantastic, so thank you very much. I also want to thank the audience. It's kind of amazing that we've kept so many people so late, and some people from where they said they were from, greetings from, were 10 hours behind. That means when we started, they were at 6:30 a.m. woke up to listen to this. So thank you to the audience and for all the questions as well. So I think that, in a small little way, for our contribution from South Africa, we tried to do something that would be befitting to Leo, that would span his whatever 50+ year marriage to Sam, to all of his progeny in Ingar and everyone else, as well as like Dinga and the trade union movements. So try to get a wide span, but also his and Sam's incredible impact in the global South, even I think beyond when they actually realized how much they were impacting us. So thank you very much to that. And yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely Friday day, Friday evening. And we shall, I think we shall continue these conversations. So Vish, I'll leave that up to you to organize. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening and a good day. Bye.
Bye everybody.
Bye.